Solomon Northup stood in a cotton field in Bayou Boeuf, Louisiana, his hands still stained with resin from the morning's work. He had been splitting rails when the carriage arrived. Two white men stepped down. One of them called his name, not the name he had been forced to answer to for 12 years. His real name, the name his father had given him. He looked up. He did not run. He did not weep. He stood still in a way that suggested he had forgotten what freedom looked like. The enslaved people around him continued working. They did not know what was happening. They knew only that one of their number was being taken somewhere, and in Louisiana in 1853, being taken somewhere usually meant something worse than staying. Solomon Northup had been a free man. He had lived in Saratoga Springs, New York. He had voted. He owned a home. He played the violin at dances. He had a wife named Anne and 3 children. In March of 1841, he accepted an offer to play music in Washington, and then he woke up in chains. For 12 years, no one came. Now someone had. By the time he returned to New York, the world he had left no longer existed. His children were grown, his wife had survived on charity, the house was gone, he sat for interviews, he testified in court, he helped write a book. And then, in the late summer of 1857, Solomon Northup vanished a second time. He was last seen in Vermont. No record of his death exists. No grave was ever found. The man who had survived 12 years of slavery simply disappeared. This is the story of how that happened. Not the disappearance, the survival. Because the disappearance makes sense. Men vanish, records are lost. But survival in the system Solomon Northup entered requires explanation. That system was not designed to allow survival. It was designed to extract everything a human body could produce and then dispose of what remained. To understand how Solomon Northup lived through 12 years of chattel slavery, you must first understand the legal and economic architecture that made his kidnapping not just possible, but routine. You must understand the trails of paper and money that transformed a citizen into property. You must understand the physicians who examined him, the traders who sold him, the masters who worked him, and the laws that protected all of them. You must understand that every single person who participated in his enslavement was operating within the law, and that is where this begins. Not with Solomon Northup, with the law. In 1793, the United States Congress passed an act concerning fugitives from justice and persons held to service or labor. The language was careful. It did not use the word slave. It used the phrase person held to labor. This was not an accident. The men who wrote the law understood that certain words carried moral weight. They chose words that carried none. The law established a process. If a person claimed that another person owed them labor in one state and that person had fled to another state, the claimant could seize the fugitive. The claimant needed only to appear before a magistrate and provide oral testimony or an affidavit. The magistrate would issue a certificate. The certificate allowed the claimant to remove the fugitive across state lines. No jury was required. No testimony from the accused was permitted. The accused had no right to present evidence. The proceeding was administrative, not criminal. It was a property dispute. The law applied everywhere in the United States. A person could be legally free in New York and legally enslaved in Virginia, and the law stated clearly which status took precedence. If you had ever been enslaved anywhere, you could be returned to that condition regardless of where you currently stood. This created a problem. How do you prove you were never enslaved? The answer is you cannot. Proving a negative is impossible. You cannot produce documentation of something that never happened. You can only produce documentation of your freedom. But documentation of freedom is not the same as proof you were never enslaved. A manumission paper proves you were enslaved and then freed. It does not prove you were born free. A birth record proves you were born. It does not prove your parents were free. A certificate of freedom proves the state acknowledged your status. It does not prove that status is accurate. In practice, this meant that any black person in the United States could be claimed as a fugitive slave, and the burden of disproving that claim rested on the accused. If the accused could not produce sufficient documentation, the magistrate would issue the certificate. The certificate was proof of nothing except the magistrate's decision, but it was legally sufficient to remove a person from a free state to a slave state. Once the person arrived in the slave state, the certificate became irrelevant. The person was no longer a fugitive, they were property. The original claimant could sell them. The new owner had no obligation to investigate their history. The system was designed to make investigation unnecessary. Between 1793 and 1850, hundreds of free black people were kidnapped under this law. The exact number is unknown because many cases left no record. A magistrate in Pennsylvania or New York would issue a certificate, and a person would disappear into the South. Their family might search for years. They might hire lawyers. They might petition governors. They might place advertisements in newspapers. Most of the time, nothing came of it. Sometimes the family had resources. Sometimes they knew where the person had been taken. Sometimes they could identify the kidnapper. In those cases, they might succeed in bringing the person back. But success required money, connections, and documentation. It required finding a white lawyer willing to take the case. It required finding white witnesses willing to testify. It required a Southern court, willing to hear the evidence. All of this had to happen before the kidnapped person was sold away from the port of entry. Once they were sold inland, recovery became nearly impossible. The trade in kidnapped free black people was sufficiently common that it had a name. In the ports and auction houses of the South, these individuals were called blackbirds. The term referred to their origin. They were not born into slavery. They were caught. The trade was illegal. Kidnapping a free person violated the laws of most northern states, but the laws were rarely enforced. Magistrates who issued certificates faced no penalty for errors. Kidnappers who were caught faced light sentences. Juries in northern states were reluctant to convict white men on the testimony of black witnesses. Juries in southern states did not care whether the person had been free. By the time a case reached a southern courtroom, the person was enslaved and their prior status was irrelevant. This was the system Solomon Northup entered in 1841. But to understand why he entered it, you must understand what he was before he was taken. Because Solomon Northup was not a fugitive. He was not a freedman. He had never been enslaved. His father had been enslaved, but his father had been manumitted in 1797. Solomon Northup was born after that date. He was born free in New York, a state that had abolished slavery in stages beginning in 1799 and completing the process in 1827. Solomon Northup had documentation. He had voted in elections. He had served on juries. He owned land. He paid taxes. He was a citizen in every legal sense except the one that mattered most. He was black, and in the United States in 1841, being black meant that citizenship was conditional. It meant that your freedom depended on the goodwill of strangers. It meant that a piece of paper signed by a magistrate could override your birth certificate, your marriage license, your deed, your tax receipts, and every other proof of your existence. It meant that if someone wanted to take you, all they needed was a magistrate who did not care whether they were telling the truth. Solomon Northup was born in July of 1808 in Minerva, Essex County, New York. His father was Mintus Northup, a man who had been enslaved by a family named Northup in Rhode Island. Mintus Northup gained his freedom in 1797 when his enslaver died and manumitted him in his will. Mintus moved to New York. He married. He worked as a farmer and laborer. He saved enough money to purchase land. This was not common, but it was not rare. In the early decades of the 19th century, the population of free black people in the northern states grew steadily. Some were manumitted. Some were born to parents who had been manumitted. Some escaped and lived under assumed names. Some purchased their own freedom. They formed communities. They built churches. They educated their children. Solomon Northup grew up in this world. He learned to read and write. He worked on his father's farm. He learned to play the violin. In 1829, he married Anne Hampton on Christmas Day. They moved to Saratoga Springs. Solomon worked a variety of jobs. He drove hacks. He worked on the construction of the Champlain Canal. He played violin at hotels and dances. Anne worked as a cook. They had 3 children, Elizabeth, Margaret, and Alonzo, Saratoga Springs was a resort town. Wealthy visitors came from New York City, from Philadelphia, from the South. They came for the mineral springs. They stayed in hotels, they danced, they gambled. They needed drivers, cooks, musicians, and servants. Solomon Northup provided services to this economy. He was known as a reliable worker. He was known as a talented violinist. He was known, this is important, Solomon Northup was not invisible. He was not anonymous. He had a reputation. People knew his face. People knew his name. People knew his wife and children. He existed in a web of social and economic relationships that vouched for his identity. That web should have protected him. It did not. In March of 1841, two white men approached Solomon Northup in Saratoga Springs. They introduced themselves as Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton. They said they were traveling to New York City with a circus. They needed a musician. They offered him generous wages. They would pay his expenses. The job would last only a few days. Solomon Northup accepted. He told Anne where he was going. He traveled with Brown and Hamilton to New York City. They paid him. They dined with him. They treated him as an equal. Then they suggested they all travel to Washington. They had another engagement there. They would pay him even more. Solomon Northup agreed. This decision has been analyzed many times. Why did he go to Washington? Why did he trust these men? Why did he travel into a city where slavery was legal? The questions are reasonable, but they rest on an assumption. They assume that Solomon Northup understood the danger. They assume he knew that Washington was a trap. But Washington in 1841 was the capital of the United States. It was a city where Congress met, where the president lived, where the Supreme Court convened. It was a place of law. Solomon Northup believed in law. He had voted. He had served on juries. He had sued a white man in court and won. He had lived his entire life in a society that told him over and over that the law protected citizens. He was a citizen. He had proof. He went to Washington because he did not believe that anyone would dare to kidnap a citizen in the nation's capital. He was wrong. The details of what happened next come from Solomon Northup's own account, published in 1853 as 12 Years a Slave. The narrative has been verified by historians. The events he describes are consistent with court records, slave manifests, and contemporaneous accounts. Where his memory is uncertain, he says so. Where he cannot name a person, he explains why. The book is a primary source document. It is also a legal document. It was written in part to support criminal prosecutions. That means it was composed with an awareness that every claim could be challenged in court. Solomon Northup arrived in Washington with Brown and Hamilton in late March of 1841. They stayed at a hotel. They drank together. Brown and Hamilton were generous. They bought rounds. They insisted Solomon join them. He drank more than he was accustomed to drinking. He began to feel ill. He returned to his room. The illness worsened. He felt dizzy. He felt a burning in his stomach. He vomited. Brown and Hamilton came to check on him. They expressed concern. They sent for a doctor. The doctor examined him and left. Solomon Northup lost consciousness. When he woke, he was in darkness. He was lying on a wooden floor. He tried to move. His wrists were chained. His ankles were chained. The chains were attached to the floor. He called out. No one answered. He heard footsteps above him. He heard voices, but he could not make out the words. Eventually a door opened. Light came in. Two men descended a staircase. One of them carried a candle. They stood over him. Solomon Northup asked where he was. One of the men told him to shut up. Solomon said he was a free man. He said he had been kidnapped. He demanded to be released. The man with the candle left. The other man remained. He was holding a paddle. The paddle was made of wood with holes drilled through it. The man told Solomon to remove his clothes. Solomon refused. The man beat him until he complied. Then the man beat him with the paddle. The holes in the paddle created suction. Each blow raised welts. The beating continued until Solomon's back was raw. The man told him he was a runaway slave from Georgia. He told him his name was not Solomon Northup. His name was Platt. He told him that, if he ever claimed to be a free man again, he would be beaten to death. Then the man left. The door closed. Solomon Northup lay on the floor in the darkness. He could not stand, he could not sit. The pain was extraordinary. He had been a free man 12 hours ago. Now he was chained in a cellar beneath the streets of Washington, and no one knew where he was. The building was a slave pen. It was owned by a man named James Birch, a slave trader. The pen was located on 7th Street, within sight of the Capitol building. Birch held kidnapped and purchased enslaved people there until he had enough to fill a ship. Then he transported them to New Orleans and sold them. The pen was legal. Washington was a city where slavery was legal. The Fugitive Slave Act allowed traders to hold accused fugitives while they awaited hearings. The city had multiple pens. They were not hidden. They were commercial operations. Visitors to Washington could see them. Members of Congress could see them. The president could see them. No one intervened. Solomon Northup remained in the pen for approximately 2 weeks. He was held with other enslaved people, some of whom had also been kidnapped. He tried to tell them his story. Some believed him, some did not. It did not matter. There was nothing they could do. Birch visited him several times. Each time, Birch demanded that Solomon admit he was a slave. Each time, Solomon refused. Birch beat him. The beatings followed a pattern. Birch would ask a question. Solomon would answer truthfully. Birch would beat him. Then Birch would ask the same question. Eventually, Solomon learned to say what Birch wanted to hear. He said he was a slave. He said his name was Platt. He said he was from Georgia. The beating stopped. This is how a person is converted into property, not through legal proceedings, through pain. The law provides the framework, but the transformation is physical. You beat a man until he stops saying he is free. Once he stops saying it, he is no longer free, because freedom is a claim. If you cannot make the claim, you do not have the status. In mid-April, Birch transported Solomon Northup and several other enslaved people to a ship called the Orleans. The ship was bound for New Orleans. Solomon was chained in the hold with approximately 40 other people. The voyage took several weeks. Many of the people in the hold were sick. Some died. Their bodies were thrown overboard. Solomon Northup tried to think of a way to escape. He could not. The chains were secure. The hold was locked. Even if he could free himself, he could not swim to shore. The ship was in the Atlantic Ocean. There was nowhere to go. He thought about his wife. He thought about his children. He tried to calculate how long it would take for Anne to realize something was wrong. He had told her he was going to New York for a few days. When would she start looking for him? Who would she ask? Would anyone believe her? He did not know that Anne had already begun searching. He did not know that she had gone to New York. He did not know that she had contacted authorities. He did not know that she had been told there was nothing they could do. He did not know that he had already been declared lost. The ship arrived in New Orleans in early May. Solomon Northup and the others were removed from the hold and taken to a slave pen owned by a man named Theophilus Freeman. Freeman operated one of the largest slave markets in New Orleans. His pen was located on Baronne Street, near the St. Charles Hotel. Wealthy planters stayed at the St. Charles when they came to New Orleans to purchase enslaved laborers. They would walk to Freeman's pen. They would examine the people for sale. They would negotiate prices. Then they would take their purchases home. Freeman prepared Solomon for sale. He was told to wash. He was given new clothes. He was told to look healthy. He was told to smile when buyers approached. He was told never to mention that he had been free. If he mentioned it, Freeman said, he would be killed. Freeman's method of selling enslaved people was efficient. He staged them in a large room called a showroom. Buyers were old enter. They would walk among the people. They would ask questions. They would examine teeth, hands, backs. They would ask people to jump, to demonstrate strength. They would ask women to undress. They would ask children to recite numbers or letters. Solomon Northup was examined by several buyers. None purchased him. Freeman grew frustrated. He lowered the price. Still no sale. The problem was that Solomon Northup did not look like a field hand. He looked like a skilled laborer. His hands were not calloused in the right way. His back bore scars from Birch's beatings, but those scars were recent. Old scars would have indicated a man accustomed to discipline. Fresh scars indicated a man who resisted. Buyers were cautious about men who resisted. After several days, a man named William Ford purchased Solomon Northup. Ford was a Baptist preacher and a planter. He owned land in the pine forests of central Louisiana, near a settlement called Bayou Boeuf. He needed laborers to cut timber and transport logs. He paid Freeman $800 for Solomon. He also purchased a young woman named Eliza and her 2 children. Freeman separated Eliza from her daughter. Eliza begged him not to. She wept. She pleaded. Freeman ignored her. The daughter was sold to another buyer. Eliza collapsed. Freeman had her dragged out of the showroom. Solomon Northup watched. He could do nothing. Ford took Solomon, Eliza, and Eliza's son to a steamboat. They traveled north on the Mississippi River, Hen west on the Red River, then into Bayou Boeuf. The journey took several days. Eliza wept the entire time. She would not eat. She would not speak except to ask where her daughter was. Ford tried to comfort her. He told her she would forget in time. She did not forget. Within a year, Eliza died of what Ford's wife called grief. Ford's plantation was located in a remote area. The nearest town was Alexandria, more than 20 miles away. The land was dense with pine trees. Ford's operation was small. He owned approximately 10 enslaved people. He worked them in the timber trade. They cut trees, shaped them into logs, floated them down the bayou to mills. Ford treated his laborers relatively well by the standards of the time. He did not beat them frequently. He provided adequate food. He allowed them to rest on Sundays. He preached to them. He believed he was saving their souls. Solomon Northup understood that Ford's kindness was conditional. It depended on obedience. It depended on productivity. It depended on never mentioning that he had been free. He did not mention it. Instead, he worked. He learned the timber trade. He built a raft to transport lumber more efficiently. Ford was impressed. He praised Solomon. He gave him small rewards. For a brief time, Solomon Northup allowed himself to hope that Ford might be persuaded to help him. Ford was educated. He was a preacher. He read the Bible. Surely he understood that kidnapping was a sin. But Solomon Northup did not ask for help. He was afraid. He had been beaten in Washington for claiming to be free. He had watched Eliza's daughter taken from her. He understood that the system protected owners, not the enslaved. If he told Ford he had been kidnapped, one of 2 things would happen. Either Ford would believe him and help him, or Ford would not believe him and punish him. The risk was too great. So Solomon said nothing. He worked. He built rafts. He cut timber. He played his violin when Ford asked him to. He pretended to be Platt, a slave from Georgia who had never known freedom, and for a time this worked. Then Ford ran into financial trouble. William Ford owed money to a carpenter named John Tibeats. Ford could not pay. In partial settlement of the debt, Ford transferred ownership of Solomon Northup to Tibeats. The transfer occurred in the spring of 1842. Solomon had been enslaved for approximately 1 year. Tibeats was not like Ford. Ford was paternalistic. He believed in the moral improvement of the enslaved. He saw himself as a benevolent master. Tibeats saw enslaved people as tools. If a tool broke, you replaced it. Tibeats set Solomon to work building a house. Solomon knew carpentry. He had learned it in New York. He worked quickly and well. Tibeats found fault with everything he did. He criticized the joints. He criticized the measurements. He criticized the pace of work. Nothing Solomon did satisfied him. This was deliberate. Tibeats was asserting dominance. He needed Solomon to understand that he was no longer working for Ford. He was working for a man who did not care about his comfort or his well-being. One morning, Tibeats gave Solomon instructions to fetch nails from a nearby plantation. Solomon went. He returned with the nails. Tibeats said they were the wrong nails. Solomon said they were the nails Tibeats had specified. Tibeats called him a liar. Solomon insisted he was correct. Tibeats told him to be silent. Solomon did not stop speaking. Tibeats struck him. Solomon Northup struck back. This is the irreversible moment. Not the kidnapping, not the sale. This. The moment Solomon Northup raised his hand against a white man in Louisiana in 1842. Tibeats was stunned. He had not expected resistance. He recovered quickly. He called for help. 2 white overseers came running. The 3 of them attacked Solomon. Solomon fought. He was stronger than Tibeats. He overpowered him. He pinned Tibeats to the ground. One of the overseers had a rope. They tied Solomon's wrists. They tied his ankles. They beat him. Then Tibeats left. He said he was going to get more men. He said they were going to hang Solomon. The overseers stayed. They kept Solomon on the ground. Solomon did not struggle. He knew struggling would make it worse. He waited. Tibeats returned with 2 other white men. They carried a rope. They fashioned a noose. They placed the noose around Solomon's neck. They threw the rope over a tree branch. They pulled. Solomon Northup was lifted off the ground. The rope tightened. He could not breathe. He could feel his vision narrowing. He thought he was going to die. Then someone shouted. The men stopped pulling. They lowered Solomon until his toes touched the ground. Just his toes. The rope remained tight. He could breathe, but barely. The men argued. Solomon could not hear what they were saying. His ears were ringing. He focused on staying on his toes. If his legs gave out, he would strangle. He stayed on his toes for more than 2 hours. What happened during those 2 hours is documented. An overseer named Chapin, who worked for William Ford, intervened. Ford still held a mortgage on Solomon. Until the debt was paid, Ford retained a financial interest in him. Chapin told Tibeats that he could not kill Solomon without Ford's permission. Tibeats argued. Chapin drew a pistol. He said if Tibeats touched the rope again, he would shoot him. Tibeats left. The other men left. Chapin remained. He did not remove the noose. He did not lower Solomon to the ground. He simply stood there, ensuring that no one killed Ford's property. Solomon Northup stood on his toes. The sun moved across the sky. His legs began to shake. He felt insects biting him. He could not brush them away because his hands were tied. He felt the rope cutting into his neck. He tried to call out, but he could barely make sound. Other enslaved people passed by. They looked at him. They did not help. They could not help. Interfering would mean their own deaths. Eventually, R&D arrived. He had been summoned by Chapin. Ford cut the rope. Solomon collapsed. Ford examined him. He asked what had happened. Solomon told him. Ford said he would speak to Tibeats. Then Ford left. Solomon lay on the ground. He could not stand. His legs would not support him. His throat was damaged. He could not swallow without pain. He thought about how close he had come to dying. He thought about the fact that he had been saved not because anyone cared whether he lived, but because he was still legally Ford's property. This is what it means to be chattel. Your life has value only in relation to debt. William Ford arranged for Solomon to be sent away from Tibeats. Ford could not free him. Ford could not return him to New York. Ford could only sell him to someone else. Ford sold him to a planter named Edwin Epps. Epps owned a cotton plantation in Bayou Boeuf. He owned approximately 30 enslaved people. He worked them in the cotton fields from first light until full darkness. He beat them regularly. He raped the women. He forced them to dance for his entertainment. He was, by the standards of the time and place, a typical cotton planter. Solomon Northup would remain the property of Edwin Epps for the next 10 years. This portion of the narrative requires care. The temptation is to catalogue the violence, to list every beating, every rape, every humiliation. But that approach reduces Solomon Northup's experience to a series of atrocities, and in doing so, it removes his humanity. Solomon Northup was not a passive victim. He was a man trying to survive. He strategized, he adapted, he resisted when resistance was possible, and submitted when submission was necessary. He maintained an internal life, even as the external world tried to erase him. The structure of life on Epps's plantation was dictated by cotton. Cotton required intensive labor. The plants had to be cultivated in the spring, chopped in the summer, and picked in the fall. Picking cotton is back-breaking work. Each enslaved person was assigned a quota. The quota was based on the individual's capacity. A strong young man might be required to pick 200 pounds per day. A woman or an older person might be required to pick 150 pounds. Children picked according to their size. At the end of each day, the cotton was weighed. If you met your quota, you received your ration of food. If you exceeded your quota, you might receive a small reward. If you fell short, you were beaten. The beating was proportional to the shortfall. 10 pounds short meant 10 lashes, 20 pounds short meant 20 lashes. Solomon Northup was not an experienced cotton picker. In his first weeks on Epps's plantation, he fell short of his quota nearly every day. Epps beat him. Solomon tried to pick faster. His hands bled, his back ached. He could not meet the quota. Epps increased the beatings. Solomon understood that if he could not learn to pick cotton faster, he would be beaten to death. So he learned Ed. He studied the other workers. He watched how they moved. He practiced. Within a few months he was meeting his quota. Within a year he was exceeding it. Epps noticed. He increased Solomon's quota. This is the logic of slavery. Competence is punished. The better you perform, the more is demanded of you. There is no reward for excellence except greater exploitation. Epps also noticed Solomon's skill with the violin. Epps enjoyed music. He forced Solomon to play at dances. He would summon Solomon in the middle of the night. He would demand that Solomon play while the other enslaved people danced. If they did not dance enthusiastically enough, Epps would whip them. Solomon would play faster. They would dance faster. This would continue for hours. Solomon hated the violin. In New York, the violin had been a source of pride and income. In Louisiana, it was an instrument of torture. But he could not refuse to play. Refusal meant a beating or worse, so he played. He played at Epps's dances. He played at neighboring plantations when Epps rented him out. He played at Christmas parties. He played at weddings. White people heard him play and complimented Epps on owning such a talented slave. Epps accepted the compliments. No one asked Solomon where he had learned to play. No one asked whether he had ever been anything other than a slave. No one was curious. Enslaved people were not supposed to have histories. They were supposed to be blank. Solomon Northup was not blank, he remembered. Ed Saratoga Springs. He remembered his wife. He remembered his children. He remembered the name his father had given him. He recited these things to himself at night. He was afraid that if he stopped reciting them, he would forget. He did not forget. But he also understood that memory was dangerous. Memory made you hope. Hope made you careless. Carelessness got you killed. So Solomon learned not to hope. He learned to endure. He worked. He picked cotton. He played the violin. He did what he was told. He avoided beatings when possible and survived them when they were unavoidable. He watched other enslaved people die and did not let himself grieve because grief was a luxury. He became Platt, not in his mind, but in his behavior. He became indistinguishable from any other enslaved man in Bayou Boeuf. He spoke when spoken to. He lowered his eyes in the presence of white people. He moved with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who had been broken. This was survival, not resistance, not collaboration. Survival. And it worked. For 10 years, it worked. Then, in the summer of 1852, a white man arrived at Epps's plantation. His name was Samuel Bass. He was a carpenter from Canada. Epps had hired him to build an addition to the main house. Bass was an abolitionist. He did not hide his views. He argued with Epps about slavery. He said it was a sin. Epps called him a fool. Bass said slaveholders would face judgment. Epps laughed. Solomon Northup listened. He did not react. He could not afford to react. But he listened. And he made a decision. He would tell Bass the truth. The decision was not impulsive. Solomon Northup spent weeks observing Bass. He listened to his arguments with Epps. He watched how Bass treated the enslaved workers. He tried to determine whether Bass could be trusted. Trust is a calculation. Solomon had to weigh the possibility that Bass would help him against the possibility that Bass would betray him. If Bass reported Solomon's story to Epps, Solomon would be killed. Epps had made this clear. Any enslaved person who claimed to be free would be beaten to death as an example to the others. But if Solomon did nothing, he would remain enslaved. 10 years had passed. No one was coming. Anne could not find him. His children could not find him. The authorities in New York had no way of knowing where he was. If Solomon wanted to escape, he would have to create his own opportunity. Bass was that opportunity one evening when Bass was working alone. Solomon approached him. He asked if they could speak privately. Bass agreed. They walked into the woods. Solomon told him everything. He said his name was not Platt, his name was Solomon Northup. He said he had been born free in New York. He said he had been kidnapped in Washington. He said he had a wife and children. He said he had been held in Louisiana for more than 10 years. He said he needed help. Bass listened. He did not interrupt. When Solomon finished, Bass asked him if he could prove any of this. Solomon said he could not. He had no documents, he had no witnesses, all he had was his word. Bass said he believed him. This moment is crucial. Bass had no rational reason to believe Solomon. Solomon's story was extraordinary. It was the kind of story enslaved people told to gain sympathy. It was the kind of story that could be fabricated. Bass had no way of verifying it, but he believed it anyway. Why? Bass's own writings suggest an answer. Bass was a Christian. He believed in the inherent sinfulness of slavery. He believed that slaveholders were damned. But belief is abstract. Meeting Solomon Northup made it concrete. Solomon was not a rhetorical figure. He was a man who spoke with precision, a man who remembered details, a man whose story had the texture of truth-based, decided to help. He asked Solomon for the names and addresses of people in New York who could verify his identity. Solomon gave him the names. Ann Northup, his friends in Saratoga Springs, his former employers. Bass wrote them down. He said he would send letters. He said he would be careful. He said Solomon should tell no one they had spoken. Bass left Epps's plantation in the fall of 1852. He traveled to Marksville, a nearby town with a post office. He composed letters. He addressed them to multiple people in New York. He posted them. Then he returned to Canada. He did not tell Solomon he had sent the letters. He did not return to Epps's plantation. He simply disappeared. Solomon waited. Weeks passed. Nothing happened. He began to suspect that Bass had changed his mind, or that the letters had been lost, or that the recipients had not believed them. He tried not to think about it. Thinking about it made it harder to endure. He worked. He picked cotton. He played the violin. He pretended to be Platt. And then, in December of 1852, a white man arrived in Bayou Boeuf asking questions about a man named Platt. The man's name was Henry Northup. He was a white lawyer from New York. He was not related to Solomon Northup by blood, but he was related to the family that had once enslaved Solomon's father. Henry Northup's father had manumitted Mintus Northup in 1797. When Mint Continue-Forum-Us took the name Northup, he took it from them. Henry Northup had received one of Bass's letters. The letter had been forwarded to him by someone in Saratoga Springs. The letter claimed that a free man named Solomon Northup was being held as a slave in Louisiana. Henry Northup investigated. He contacted Ann Northup. He reviewed documents. He confirmed that Solomon Northup had indeed disappeared in 1841. He confirmed that Solomon Northup had been a free man. Then he did something remarkable. He decided to go to Louisiana and retrieve him. This was not easy. Henry Northup could not simply arrive in Louisiana and demand Solomon's release. Louisiana law did not recognize the authority of New York officials. Henry Northup needed legal authorization. He needed documents proving Solomon's status. He needed evidence that Solomon had been kidnapped. He petitioned the governor of New York. The governor issued papers. The papers authorized Henry Northup to act on behalf of the state of New York in recovering a kidnapped citizen. The papers were not a court order. They were a request. Louisiana authorities were not obligated to honor them, but they provided legal standing. Henry Northup traveled to Louisiana in late 1852. He arrived in New Orleans. He contacted a local lawyer. The lawyer advised him that recovering Solomon would be difficult. He would need to locate Solomon. He would need to prove Solomon's identity. He would need to prove Solomon had been free. He would need to convince a Louisiana court to release him. Each of these steps could fail. Henry Northup had one advantage. Bass's letter had specified that Solomon was held in Bayou Boeuf. It had named Edwin Epps as the enslaver. This was enough information to begin a search. Henry Northup traveled to Bayou Boeuf. He made inquiries. He asked about a man named Platt who played the violin. People knew who he meant. They directed him to Epps's plantation. Henry Northup did not approach Epps directly. He contacted a local official. The official arranged a meeting. On January 4, 1853, Henry Northup and the official arrived at Epps's plantation. They asked to see Platt. Epps was suspicious. He asked why they wanted to see him. Henry Northup said he needed to verify Platt's identity. Epps asked what he meant. Henry Northup say, "ID that Platt might be a free man who had been kidnapped." Epps said that was impossible. Platt was a slave. He had purchased him from William Ford. He had owned him for 10 years. He had papers proving ownership. Henry Northup said the papers were irrelevant if Platt had been kidnapped. He asked to speak to Platt privately. Epps refused. He said Platt was his property. He could refuse entry to anyone. Henry Northup showed him the documents from the governor of New York. Epps read them. He said they had no authority in Louisiana. The local official intervened. He suggested that Epps allow the meeting. If Platt was indeed a slave, the meeting would prove it. Platt would not be able to answer questions about New York. The claim would be disproven. Epps would be vindicated. Epps agreed. He summoned Solomon from the field. Solomon Northup did not know what was happening. He had been picking cotton. An overseer told him he was needed at the house. He walked to the house. He saw 2 white men he did not recognize. One of them looked at him carefully. Henry Northup asked him his name. Solomon said his name was Platt. Henry Northup asked where he was from. Solomon said Georgia. These were the answers he had been trained to give. He had given them for 12 years. Henry Northup asked if he had ever been to New York. Solomon said no. Henry Northup asked if he knew anyone in Saratoga Springs. Solomon said no. Henry Northup looked at him for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Do you Now Ann Northup?" Solomon froze. No one had spoken his wife's name in 12 years. No one in Louisiana knew her name. He had recited it to himself at night, but he had never said it aloud. Hearing it spoken by a stranger was like hearing a voice from the dead. He looked at Henry Northup. He did not speak. He was afraid this was a trap. He was afraid Epps was testing him. Henry Northup said, "Do you have children named Elizabeth, Margaret, and Alonzo?" Solomon's legs nearly gave out. He steadied himself. He looked at Epps. Epps was staring at him. Solomon made a decision. He said yes. Epps stepped forward. He said Solomon was lying. He said Solomon was trying to escape. He said he would have him whipped for this. Henry Northup stood between them. He told Epps to step back. He told Epps that Solomon Northup was a free citizen of New York. He told Epps that Solomon had been kidnapped. He told Epps that he had documents proving it. Epps demanded to see the documents. Henry Northup showed him. Epps read them. He said the documents proved nothing. He said anyone could forge documents. He said Solomon was a liar. The local officials suggested they take the matter to court. A judge could hear the evidence. The judge would decide. Epps agreed, but reluctantly. He believed a Louisiana judge would rule in his favor. Henry Northup believed a Louisiana judge could be persuaded by evidence. Solomon Northup believed nothing. He had learned not to believe. The hearing took place in January of 1853 in a courthouse in Marksville. Epps brought his bill of sale. The bill proved he had purchased Solomon from William Ford. Ford's bill of sale proved he had purchased Solomon from Theophilus Freeman. Freeman's bill of sale proved he had purchased Solomon from James Birch. The chain of ownership was clear. Solomon was property. Property could be bought and sold. The sales were legal. Henry Northup presented a different argument. He presented documents from New York proving that Solomon Northup was born free. He presented testimony from witnesses who knew Solomon in Saratoga Springs. He presented Ann Northup's affidavit. He presented evidence of Solomon's disappearance in 1841. The judge examined the evidence. He asked Solomon questions. Solomon answered. He described Saratoga Springs. He named streets. He named buildings. He named people. The judge asked him about his work. Solomon described driving hacks. He described playing violin at hotels. He named specific hotels. He named specific employers. The judge asked him to describe his wife. Solomon described Anne. He described their wedding. He described their children. He gave their birth dates. The judge asked him how he ended up in Louisiana. Solomon described meeting Brown and Hamilton. He described traveling to Washington. He described waking up in chains. He described the slave pen. He described the beatings. He described the voyage to New Orleans. He described Freeman's showroom. He described being sold to Foe. He described being sold to Tibeats. He described being sold to Epps. The judge listened. When Solomon finished, the judge turned to Epps. He asked Epps if he had known Solomon was free when he purchased him. Epps said no. The judge asked if Epps had any reason to doubt Solomon's story. Epps said the story was absurd. He said enslaved people lied all the time. He said Solomon was simply trying to escape. The judge asked Solomon if he could prove he had been in Washington. Solomon said he could not. He had no witnesses. Brown and Hamilton had disappeared. Birch would not testify against himself. There was no physical evidence. The judge considered this, then he asked if anyone could corroborate Solomon's account of life in Saratoga Springs. Henry Northup said he had affidavits from multiple witnesses. The judge read them. The witnesses stated that they knew Solomon Northup. They stated that he was a free man. They stated that he had disappeared in 1841. The judge ruled in favor of Solomon Northup. The ruling was narrow. The judge did not declare that Solomon had been kidnapped. The judge did not order anyone arrested. The judge simply declared that the evidence was sufficient to establish that Solomon Northup had been a free man prior to his enslavement. Therefore, his enslavement was invalid. Therefore, he must be released. Epps was ordered to surrender Solomon immediately. Epps complied. He had no choice. But he was furious. He believed he had been robbed. He had paid money for Solomon. He had owned him for 10 years. Now he was being forced to give him up without compensation. As Solomon left the courthouse, Epps shouted after him. He said Solomon was a liar and a thief. He said Solomon had stolen 10 years of labor. He said he hoped Solomon would be kidnapped again. Solomon did not respond. He walked out of the courthouse with Henry Northup. They traveled to New Orleans. They boarded a steamship. The ship traveled north. Solomon stood on the deck and watched Louisiana disappear. He had survived. But survival is not the same as freedom. Solomon Northup arrived in New York in January of 1853. He had been gone for 12 years. His children were adults. Elizabeth was 26, Margaret was 23, Alonzo was 21. They had married, they had children of their own. Solomon was a grandfather. He did not recognize them. They did not recognize him. Anne recognized him. She had never stopped looking for him. She had written letters. She had petitioned officials. She had contacted lawyers. She had spent every dollar she could save. She had survived on hope. Now he was home. The reunion was not joyful. Solomon was damaged. He did not sleep. He startled at sudden movements. He spoke rarely. When he did speak, he spoke quietly, as though afraid of being overheard. He flinched when people raised their voices. He could not bear to be touched. Anne tried to comfort him. He could not be comforted. He had spent 12 years in a state of constant vigilance. Vigilance was the only thing that had kept him alive. He could not simply turn it off. His friends tried to help. They visited. They offered money. They offered work. Solomon accepted the money. He did not accept the work. He could not imagine working for wages again. Wages implied a contract. A contract implied trust. He did not trust anyone. Someone suggested he write a book. The suggestion came from a lawyer and abolitionist named David Wilson. Wilson said Solomon's story could help the abolitionist cause. It could demonstrate the horrors of slavery. It could prove that free black people were being kidnapped and sold. It could galvanize public opinion. Solomon agreed, but not for political reasons. He agreed because he needed money. He had returned to New York with nothing. Anne had survived on charity. They had debts. Solomon could not work. Writing a book was the only way he could earn. Wilson interviewed Solomon over several weeks. Solomon described everything he could remember. Wilson took notes. He checked facts. He verified names and dates. He contacted people Solomon had mentioned. He confirmed their existence. He wanted the book to be unimpeachable. The book was published in July of 1853 under the title 12 Years a Slave, Narrative of Solomon Northup, a citizen of New York, kidnapped in Washington City in 1841 and rescued in 1853, from a cotton plantation near the Red River in Louisiana. It was an immediate success. It sold thousands of copies in the first month. It was reviewed in newspapers across the North. It was excerpted in abolitionist publications. It was read aloud at anti-slavery meetings. People were horrified. They had known that slavery was brutal. But Solomon's account made the brutality specific. It provided names, it provided places, it described mechanisms. The book also created a legal problem. Solomon's account implicated James Birch, the slave trader in Washington. Birch had beaten Solomon. Birch had transported him to Louisiana. Birch had sold him into slavery. Under New York law, kidnapping a free citizen was a crime. Solomon filed charges. Birch was arrested in Washington in 1853. He was brought to trial. Solomon testified. He described the beatings. He described the slave pen. He described the voyage to New Orleans. The jury heard his testimony. The jury also heard Birch's defense. Birch claimed he had purchased Solomon from Brown and Hamilton. He claimed they had told him Solomon was a runaway slave from Georgia. He claimed he had no reason to doubt them. He claimed he was simply a trader conducting legal business. The jury deliberated. They acquitted Birch. The acquittal was not surprising. Under the law, Birch's intent mattered. If Birch genuinely believed Solomon was a slave, then he had committed no crime. Birch claimed he believed it. The prosecution could not prove otherwise. Brown and Hamilton had disappeared. No one could locate them. Without their testimony, there was no way to establish that Birch had knowingly participated in a kidnapping. Solomon was devastated. He had testified in court. He had told the truth. The truth had not mattered. Birch walked free. No one was ever prosecuted for Solomon's kidnapping. This is important. Solomon Northup was kidnapped. He was held in slavery for 12 years. He was beaten. He was nearly killed. He was sold multiple times. All of this was documented. All of this was verified. And no one was held accountable. The system had functioned exactly as designed. After the trial, Solomon tried to resume a normal life. He could not. He gave lectures about his experiences. Abolitionists invited him to speak at meetings. He stood on stages and described what had happened to him. Audiences wept. Audiences applauded. Audiences asked questions. Solomon answered their questions. But each lecture required him to relive his captivity. Each lecture required him to describe the beatings, the rapes, the deaths. Each lecture required him to perform his trauma for strangers. He stopped giving lectures. He tried to find work. He applied for jobs. Employers were hesitant. Solomon's story was famous. Everyone knew who he was. Employers worried that hiring him would attract attention. They worried about controversy. They offered excuses. Solomon stopped applying. He withdrew. He spent time with his family. He met his grandchildren. He tried to teach them the violin. He could not. Every time he picked up the violin, he remembered playing for Epps. He remembered the dances. He remembered the whippings. He put the violin away. Anne tried to understand. She could not. She had suffered too. She had spent 12 years not knowing whether he was alive. She had raised their children alone. She had endured poverty and uncertainty. But her suffering was different. She had never been enslaved. She could not imagine what he had endured. The distance between them grew. In 1857, Solomon received an invitation to speak in Vermont. The invitation came from an abolitionist organization. They offered to pay his expenses. Solomon accepted. He needed money. He traveled to Vermont alone. He gave his lecture. The audience responded warmly. After the lecture, several people approached him. They asked if he would stay in Vermont for a few days. They wanted to introduce him to other abolitionists. Solomon agreed. He stayed in Vermont for a week. Then he disappeared. There are no records of what happened. No one filed a missing person report. No newspaper reported his disappearance. No family member initiated a search. Solomon Northup simply vanished. Several theories have been proposed. Some historians believe he was kidnapped again. Some believe he died of natural causes and was buried in an unmarked grave. Some believe he left voluntarily, unable to bear the weight of his fame. The most likely explanation is the simplest. Solomon Northup was a traumatized man in a society that had no concept of trauma. He had survived 12 years of slavery. He had been rescued. He had testified in court. He had published a book, and none of it had changed anything. Slavery was still legal. Kidnappers were still operating. Free black people were still being taken. The system that had enslaved him was still functioning. Perhaps he concluded that there was no point in continuing. Perhaps he simply walked away. Perhaps he decided that disappearing a second time was preferable to living with the memory of the first. No one knows. The last confirmed sighting of Solo. Mon Northup was in Vermont in the summer of 1857. He was 49 years old. To understand why Solomon Northup vanished, you must understand what he returned to. He returned to a country that had not changed. The Fugitive Slave Act was still in force. The Supreme Court had just ruled in the Dred Scott case that black people could not be citizens. The ruling stated explicitly that black people had no rights that white people were bound to respect. This was the law of the land. Solomon Northup had been declared a citizen by a Louisiana court. The Louisiana court had ruled that his enslavement was invalid because he had been free, but the Supreme Court had ruled that no black person could be a citizen. The two rulings were incompatible. In practical terms, this meant that Solomon's status was uncertain. He was free in New York. But if he traveled to a slave state, he could be seized again. The Fugitive Slave Act allowed it. The Supreme Court endorsed it. There was no protection. Solomon understood this. He had been to Louisiana. He knew how the system worked. He knew that his freedom was conditional. It depended on where he stood. It depended on who saw him. It depended on whether anyone decided to claim him. This is not freedom. This is probation. Solomon also understood that his testimony had accomplished nothing. He had exposed James Birch. Birch had been acquitted. He had described the slave pens in Washington. The slave pens were still operating. He had described the brutality of plantation life. The plantations were still producing cotton. His suffering had been documented. His suffering had been verified. His suffering had been commodified into a best-selling book, and nothing had changed. This is what trauma does. It removes the belief that the world is just. It removes the belief that actions have consequences. It removes the belief that truth matters. Solomon Northup had believed in law. He had believed in justice. He had believed that if he told the truth would set him free. He told the truth. The truth became a book. The book became a commodity. He was still not free. Perhaps this is why he disappeared. Not because he was kidnapped. Not because he died. But because he chose to stop existing in a world that had proven itself incapable of acknowledging his existence. This is speculation. There is no evidence. But the absence of evidence is itself evidence. Solomon Northup was famous in 1857. His disappearance should have been news. It was not. No newspaper reported it. No abolitionist organization investigated. No family member publicly searched for him. The silence suggests that his disappearance was not unexpected. It suggests that the people who knew him understood that he was gone before he left. The mechanisms that enslaved Solomon Northup did not end with his rescue. They continued, they adapted, they evolved. James Birch continued operating his slave pen in Washington until 1850, when Congress abolished the slave trade in the District of Columbia. The law did not abolish slavery, it abolished the trade. Birch could no longer buy and sell enslaved people in Washington. He moved his operation to Virginia. Theophilus Freeman continued operating his slave market in New Orleans until 1863, when Union forces occupied the city. Freeman fled. He was never prosecuted. Edwin Epps continued operating his plantation in Bayou Boeuf until 1865, when the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. Epps was not compensated for his losses. He died in poverty. Samuel Bass, the Canadian carpenter who helped Solomon, returned to Canada. He continued working as a carpenter. He never spoke publicly about his role in Solomon's rescue. He died in 1869. Henry Northup, the lawyer who retrieved Solomon from Louisiana, continued practicing law in New York. He became involved in Republican politics. He supported the abolition of slavery. He died in 1894. Anne Northup outlived Solomon. She lived until the 1870s. She never remarried. She never spoke publicly about Solomon's kidnapping. She died in obscurity. None of Solomon's children wrote about their father. None of them gave interviews. None of them preserved his letters or documents. They let him disappear. This erasure was not accidental. It was protective. Being the child of a famous kidnapping victim was dangerous. It made you visible. Visibility made you vulnerable. In the decades after Solomon's disappearance, thousands of free black people were kidnapped and enslaved. The practice continued through the Civil War. It continued during Reconstruction. It continued into the 20th century. The mechanisms were always the same. A person would be seized. They would be accused of being a fugitive. They would be brought before a magistrate. The magistrate would issue a certificate. The person would disappear. The system worked because it was designed to work. It was not a series of individual crimes. It was structural, it was legal, it was profitable, and it was invisible. Most people in the North did not know it was happening. They did not read the missing person advertisements. They did not attend the trials. They did not visit the slave pens. They bought cotton. They wore cotton clothes. They used cotton sheets. They benefited from the system. They did not ask where the cotton came from. Solomon Northup's book tried to make them ask. It tried to show them the mechanisms. It tried to make the invisible visible, and for a brief moment it succeeded. The book was popular. People read it. People talked about it. Then the Civil War began. The book was forgotten. People had other concerns. The war was about slavery, but it was also about union, about sovereignty, about economics. Solomon Northup's story was too specific. Too individual. Too uncomfortable. After the war, the book disappeared. It went out of print. Libraries discarded it. Collectors ignored it. For more than a century, it was essentially lost. It was rediscovered in the 1960s by historians researching the antebellum slave trade. They found copies in archives. They verified Solomon's account. They confirmed the names, the dates, the places. Everything he had written was true. The book was republished. It was taught in schools. It was adapted into a film. Solomon Northup became famous again, but this time he was famous as a historical figure, not as a man, as a symbol. Symbols are useful. They teach lessons. They inspire movements. They provide moral clarity. But symbols are not people. People are complicated. People suffer. People disappear. Solomon Northup disappeared twice. Once in 1841 when he was kidnapped. Once in 1857 when he vanished. The first disappearance was a crime. The second was a choice. And perhaps the choice was the only form of freedom he ever truly possessed. Return to the beginning. Solomon Northup stood in a cotton field in Bayou Boeuf, Louisiana, in the spring of 1853. He had been there for 12 years. He had survived. Survival is often described as a victory. It is not. Survival is simply the absence of death. Solomon Northup survived because he was useful. He could pick cotton. He could play the violin. He could build rafts. He could endure pain. He could submit when submission was required and assist when resistance was possible. He could maintain the fiction of being Platt while remembering that he was Solomon. He survived because Samuel Bass believed him. Bass had no rational reason to believe him, but he did. And he acted. Bass could have ignored Solomon's story. He could have dismissed it as fantasy. He could have reported it to Epps. Any of those choices would have been easier. Bass chose the difficult path. He wrote the letters. He took the risk. Henry Northup came to Louisiana because he believed in law. He believed that legal documents mattered. He believed that a certificate from the governor of New York would be honored in Louisiana. He believed that a judge would examine evidence and rule justly. He was right. The judge did examine evidence. The judge did rule justly. But justice was not inevitable. It was contingent. It depended on Solomon being able to answer questions. It depended on Henry Northup having documents. It depended on Epps not simply killing Solomon before the hearing. Any of those contingencies could have failed. Solomon Northup was rescued not because the system worked. He was rescued in spite of the system.